The flames devoured the home in minutes. Black smoke billowed out of the windows, curling into the morning sky as neighbors stood helplessly on the street. When firefighters pushed through the back door of the burning Georgia house, they weren't prepared for what they found. In the master bedroom, illuminated by the flickering glow of the fire, was a man slumped on his knees beside the bed, as if he had been praying for deliverance before the smoke overcame him. His body was lifeless, his skin stained with soot, his clothes charred but not consumed. He hadn't tried to escape. He hadn't even made it to the door. It looked at first like the tragic death of a husband caught in a fire. But appearances, as investigators would soon discover, can be the cruelest deception. James Conley was not just a husband or a father. He was a man who had built a respectable life from scratch, a man admired in his community. And yet, in his final moments, his fate had been sealed not by chance, but by betrayal inside his very own home. To the world outside, his marriage had been a picture of stability. To his children, their household was a sanctuary of warmth. To his neighbors, James and Teresa seemed like the perfect couple, successful, accomplished, and devoted. But behind closed doors, greed, lies, and secrets had been quietly eroding their family's foundation. And as the fire raged through the Conley home that June morning in 2007, everything they had built turned to ash. James Edward Conley was born on February 22, 1950, in Dayton, Ohio, into a family where success wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. His grandfather had patented one of the first price-marking machines, a small invention that made the family wealthy and gave them a sense of lasting legacy. But James was different. He didn't crave the family business or a life dictated by his ancestors' achievements. Instead, he chose his own path. He studied holistic therapy, building a career as a manual therapist. He eventually relocated to North Georgia, where he poured his life into establishing a wellness practice. Patients trusted him. Families returned to him. His reputation was spotless. It was in this world that James met Teresa, a young woman 20 years his junior. She was only 21 when she applied for a receptionist position at his clinic, bright-eyed and eager. James was nearly 40, successful and confident, with a calming presence that drew people in. Despite their age difference, their connection was undeniable. Soon they were inseparable. By 1996, they had a son, Caleb, and a year later, they married and opened the Alpha Wellness Center in Dalton, Georgia. Teresa worked as a massage therapist alongside her husband. Friends described them as a team, devoted, ambitious, and deeply in love. Their second child, Allison, was born in 2000. That same year, they moved into a large house near a tennis court in Ringgold, Georgia. To anyone looking in, it was a dream life. 2 healthy children, a thriving business, and a comfortable home. Caleb would later remember Christmases filled with warmth and joy. His father always reminding him of his importance, his mother bustling around the tree with perfectionist energy. From the outside, it looked like the very definition of the American dream. But perfection is fragile, and in the Conley household, cracks had already begun to form. James, always cautious, had purchased a $500,000 life insurance policy with Teresa as the sole beneficiary. He also insured their home. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a responsible decision. But in hindsight, it was the first shadow of what was to come. Over the years, whispers of trouble began to spread. Employees at the wellness center gossiped about Teresa's flirtations and rumors of infidelity. James himself began to suspect that his coffee was being laced with lithium, a claim that sounded paranoid but was repeated enough times to make colleagues uneasy. At the same time, the family faced financial strain. 2 of their cars were repossessed. James contracted Lyme disease, which left him unable to work. Teresa endured multiple surgeries, suffered a miscarriage, and fell into depression that spiraled into substance abuse. Their once thriving business began to falter. The woman who had once seemed so ambitious, so full of drive, now stood accused of quietly draining the company's finances. Bonnie, their trusted accountant, discovered that Teresa had been writing checks to herself, 16 in 1 month alone. When James confronted her, Teresa denied everything, even when Bonnie presented the proof. The lie was blatant, and the air between husband and wife grew heavier with distrust. By mid-2007, the tension had reached a breaking point. The Conleys received a foreclosure notice. They were on the brink of losing their home. Divorce loomed on the horizon. But Teresa was not a woman who intended to start over from nothing. She had another plan, a plan as cold as it was devastating. She began by drafting a letter, forging James's handwriting, in which he supposedly confessed his intent to end his own life. It was meant to lay the groundwork, to make his eventual death appear as nothing more than a tragic suicide. But that was only the beginning. On the morning of June 29, 2007, Teresa prepared breakfast. As James sat across from her, unaware of what was to come, she stirred strong antidepressants into his food. He ate. She didn't. She excused herself, telling him that a friend named Robin was coming to pick her and the children up. James never suspected that this would be the last breakfast of his life. With her children in the car and under the watch of Robin, Teresa returned to the house alone. She quietly packed away personal belongings she deemed important. Photographs of her children, small valuables, anything she didn't want lost. And then, with chilling precision, she set fire to her own home. From the back seat of the car, Caleb noticed smoke curling into the sky. Alarmed, he turned to his mother. "Mom, the house is burning," he cried. But Teresa only lit a cigarette and told him not to worry. "It's just some papers burning," she said calmly. To an 11-year-old boy, the words were confusing. To investigators later, they were damning. By the time firefighters arrived, the flames had consumed nearly everything. Inside, James was found kneeling by the bed, his body limp, his lungs filled with smoke. The fire had destroyed most evidence. At first glance, his death seemed like a tragic accident. But the truth was far darker. And for investigators in Georgia, the Conley fire was about to become one of the most haunting cases they had ever faced. The silence inside the Conley house was deceptive. To the neighbors, the house looked ordinary, with its neatly trimmed hedges and porch light glowing faintly in the night. But inside, that silence was thick and unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. James Conley sat in the dimly lit living room, motionless, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Just hours ago, he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Teresa, the woman who had once been his partner, lay lifeless in their bedroom, her body a grim reminder of a love gone horribly wrong. The air still carried the metallic tang of blood, a smell that would linger far longer than he anticipated. James stared at his hands, trembling slightly as though they no longer belonged to him. They were stained, not visibly, he had cleaned them meticulously, but he could feel the invisible mark of what they had done. Every sound from the house seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, even the rhythmic ticking of the clock. It was as though the house itself was mocking him, replaying his guilt in echoes he could not escape. But James's thoughts were not of remorse. Instead, they darted between fear and calculation. He had always been meticulous, always prided himself on being in control, and now he had to regain that control more than ever. He thought of Teresa's voice, the way it would cut into him with words he couldn't bear to hear anymore. To him, she had become unbearable, a weight, a constant reminder of failures and disappointments. In his twisted mind, silencing her had felt like taking back control of his life. Now, though, control slipped further away with every passing second. He knew someone would come looking for her. Teresa was not the type to vanish without a word. She had friends, coworkers, people who checked in. It wouldn't be long before someone noticed her absence, and when they did, suspicion would inevitably turn toward him. The phone rang suddenly, shattering the silence and making James's heart lurch violently in his chest. He froze, staring at the device as it buzzed on the side table. For a moment he considered letting it go unanswered, but that would seem suspicious. With a deep breath, he picked it up, forcing his voice into a calm, steady tone. It was Teresa's sister, asking if she had made it home safely after their last conversation earlier that evening. James lied effortlessly, saying Teresa had stepped out for a walk and would be back soon. His voice was convincing, smooth even, but when he hung up, his hands were damp with sweat. The night dragged on. James wandered the house, occasionally glancing toward the bedroom where Teresa's body lay. He avoided entering, but his mind wouldn't let him forget. Each time he tried to focus on a plan, the memory of her last expression returned. Her wide eyes, her lips parted as if to protest, the final look of betrayal frozen on her face. He tried to push it aside, convincing himself that she had forced him into this, that he was the victim. Morning light began to creep through the blinds, and with it came new dread. Teresa's absence would no longer be hidden in the quiet cloak of night. Soon people would begin to call to ask questions. He needed a story, something airtight that would explain her disappearance. He rehearsed lines in his head, picturing detectives questioning him. He would act concerned, confused, heartbroken even. But no matter how he practiced, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth would seep out through some small crack in his performance. By noon, Teresa's sister called again, this time more insistent. James tried to sound calm, assuring her that everything was fine, but she wasn't convinced. She mentioned stopping by the house later that evening, and James's chest tightened. Panic surged through him. The walls of the house seemed to close in, the ticking clock growing louder, each second pounding like a drum of doom. He glanced again at the closed bedroom door and realized that hiding Teresa forever inside their home was impossible. Something had to be done. James decided he would move her body, but even the thought made his stomach churn. He had never considered the logistics of such a thing, and now the reality was overwhelming. He needed to act fast, but he also needed to be careful. Every decision carried risks. Neighbors might see him, evidence might be left behind, and one mistake could undo everything. Still, the choice had been made the moment he took Teresa's life. Now he had to follow through no matter the cost. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, James steeled himself. The house had become unbearable, haunted by Teresa's silence, by his own racing thoughts. His hands shook as he reached for the bedroom door, knowing that the next step in his plan would be the most dangerous yet. He paused, inhaling deeply, then pushed the door open. The sight of Teresa's body, still and pale, nearly brought him to his knees. But he forced himself to stay upright, reminding himself of the story he needed to maintain, the lies he had to sell. In his mind, this was no longer about guilt or grief, it was about survival. He had silenced Teresa forever, but now he had to silence the truth itself. And as the day faded into night, James realized something chilling. The hardest part of the crime was not the act itself, but everything that came after. The hours after James Conley opened that bedroom door felt like a descent into madness. The weight of the air inside the room was unbearable, thick with the scent of death and something darker, fear. He stood frozen at first, staring at Teresa's body as though time itself had stopped. But time was moving, faster than he wanted, and every passing second brought him closer to discovery. Teresa's sister had already grown suspicious, and James knew that once she stepped foot in this house, everything would unravel. He forced himself to move, though his legs felt heavy as though they were shackled to the floor. His mind spun wildly with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Where could he take her? How would he carry her? What would he do if anyone saw? He paced the room, muttering to himself, rehearsing different scenarios, each one ending in disaster. Finally he settled on a plan. The old shed behind the house, rarely used, hidden by overgrown hedges and the shadows of the trees, it would serve as a temporary hiding place. Not perfect, but enough to buy him time. He could deal with the details later. What mattered now was getting Teresa out of sight before anyone came knocking. But when James moved to lift her, reality struck with brutal force. Teresa's body was heavier than he anticipated, limp and unyielding. Every attempt to hoist her sent a chill down his spine. Her skin was cold now, lifeless, and the feeling made his stomach turn. He had imagined himself capable of this, but the truth was far more grotesque than the dark scenarios he had conjured in his head. Still, survival demanded that he push through. He wrapped her in a sheet, pulling it tight to hide her form, and braced himself for the task ahead. Dragging her across the room, every creak of the floorboards felt like an alarm, each sound amplified in his head. He paused often, listening for footsteps outside or the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. The silence was maddening. It felt as though the world outside had vanished, leaving only him, the house, and the secret he carried. When he finally reached the back door, his heart nearly stopped. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and James froze, clutching the bundled sheet tighter. He waited, breath shallow, until the barking ceased. Then, summoning every ounce of strength, he dragged Teresa's body through the door and across the lawn. The grass whispered beneath the weight, and the night air felt colder than before, pressing against his skin like ice. The shed loomed in front of him, its wooden door weathered and crooked. He pulled it open, the rusty hinges shrieking in protest. James winced, cursing under his breath, but forced himself forward. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the smell of old wood and rust. He laid her down in the far corner, covering her with an old tarp and some discarded boxes. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would have to do. For a moment, he stood there in the darkness of the shed, his breath ragged, his shirt clinging to his sweat-drenched back. He tried to convince himself that this was enough, that he could buy time, that he was still in control. But the truth pressed down harder than the weight he had just carried. Teresa wasn't gone. Her absence was a ticking clock, and sooner or later people would notice. As he stepped back inside the house, James tried to regain composure. He rehearsed what he would say when Teresa's sister arrived, how he would feign concern, perhaps even suggest she had left after an argument. He practiced his expressions in the mirror, forcing his features into sorrow, into confusion, into worry. But his eyes betrayed him. No matter how convincing his act, his eyes held the truth, wild, restless, hunted. The day crept into night again and the dread only grew. James couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, that the house was under silent surveillance. Every car that drove past made him stiffen, every knock of wind against the windows sent his heart racing. He began to notice small details he hadn't before: the faint smear of blood on the hallway floor, a strand of Teresa's hair clinging to his shirt. No matter how carefully he tried to clean, the house felt contaminated, filled with evidence of his crime. By midnight, James sat alone at the kitchen table, the silence unbearable. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, then another, trying to drown the noise in his head. But no amount of alcohol could silence the truth. This was only the beginning. Teresa's absence would ignite suspicion, and suspicion would bring questions he couldn't answer. As the night dragged on, James whispered to himself over and over, "Stay calm. Stay in control." But the more he repeated it, the more it sounded like a desperate plea. Deep down, he knew control had slipped from his grasp the moment Teresa took her last breath. And somewhere in the darkness of the shed, her presence lingered, a silent witness to his unraveling. The following morning brought no peace. James Conley awoke slumped over the kitchen table, an empty glass beside him and a gnawing unease crawling beneath his skin. The house was unbearably quiet, too quiet. He couldn't shake the sense that Teresa's silence was louder than her presence had ever been. Every shadow in the room felt accusing, every creak of the old floorboards like footsteps closing in. By mid-morning the phone rang again. Teresa's sister was on the line, her voice edged with alarm. She hadn't heard from Teresa in over a day and wanted to know where she was. James clutched the phone tightly, his knuckles whitening as he repeated the lie he had rehearsed. Teresa had left the house after an argument, storming off without a word about where she was going. He feigned worry, even added a tremor to his voice. But when the call ended, James knew his story wouldn't hold forever. That evening there was a knock at the door. Teresa's sister stood on the porch, her face pale with concern. James forced himself to appear calm, inviting her in, but every second of her presence felt dangerous. She asked questions, her eyes searching his face for answers. James delivered his rehearsed lines, but there was something in her gaze that unsettled him. She wasn't convinced. When she left, she said she might call the police if Teresa didn't turn up soon. The word struck James like a death sentence. As the hours crawled by, James paced the house in agitation. He went out to the shed twice, checking the tarp, making sure everything was hidden. But paranoia gnawed at him. What if a neighbor had seen him? What if the smell began to seep out? The thought of police dogs, of detectives combing through his property, made his chest tighten until he could hardly breathe. By the third day, suspicion had grown unbearable. Friends, neighbors, co-workers, people were asking where Teresa was. Her sister had kept her promise and contacted the authorities. Detectives arrived at James's doorstep, knocking with polite firmness. James greeted them with a carefully crafted mask of worry, his voice trembling as he told them Teresa had simply walked out. He offered to help search, to answer any questions. But the detectives weren't fooled so easily. Their eyes lingered too long on the hallway, on the faint discoloration in the carpet that James hadn't scrubbed thoroughly enough. They noticed his nervous gestures, the way he avoided certain questions. Each word he spoke only deepened the cracks in his story. When the officers left, promising to be in touch, James collapsed into a chair, his body trembling. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, suffocating him. He poured another drink, but even the alcohol no longer dulled the panic. The silence of the shed outside weighed heavily on him, as if Teresa herself was calling out, demanding justice. Days turned into a blur. Police returned, asking more pointed questions. They requested access to the property, and James felt the ground crumbling beneath him. He tried to maintain composure, but the paranoia was consuming him. He imagined flashing lights outside, imagined the sound of shovels digging into the earth. He imagined the moment they would peel back the tarp in the shed and reveal his terrible secret. And then the day came. The shed door was pulled open, the musty air spilling out into the sunlight. Officers stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the darkness. In seconds, the illusion James had built for himself shattered. Beneath the tarp, Teresa's body lay in silence, her lifeless form exposing the truth he had tried so desperately to bury. James watched from the kitchen window as they carried her out. His face was pale, his body rigid, but inside he was unraveling. Everything he had done to maintain control had been an illusion. The story he thought he could manipulate had slipped from his grasp, and now the whole world would know. When the officers returned to the house, their voices firm, their hands ready with cuffs, James offered no resistance. For the first time since that night he was still. The facade of control, the lies, the rehearsed expressions, all of it fell away. As they led him out of the house, the neighbors watched in stunned silence, whispering among themselves. James's eyes flickered once toward the shed, where the truth had been uncovered. In that moment he realized the haunting truth: the hardest part of a crime isn't committing it. It's living with the silence afterward, the silence that grows louder every day until it destroys everything. And as the door of the police car slammed shut, James Conley knew that silence would follow him for the rest of his life.